these are difficult and inspiring times that we're going through right now, dealing with the murder of George Floyd in the near term, and in the broader context, the centuries of historical injustices done to African Americans in the United States, and indeed in many ways around the world. There's so much to protest now, to deal with now, and so what I want to do in today's video is to try to bring that back into an early Buddhist context, to try to figure out what early Buddhism might have to say about sort of similar kinds of things that were going on back then. But for now, I would also like to, I will be putting down in the show notes a link to a Charity Navigator site about different civil rights organizations that you might consider donating to if that interests you. Because this problem that we're dealing with right now is one that we've needed to deal with for a very, very long time, and frankly, the sooner the better. It's going to take a long time to deal with this, even if we work at it diligently. So let's make best use of this time. The best thing to say to all of you, and I think to repeat, is that Black lives matter. They must matter, and it's something that we cannot remain silent about. So again, what I want to do today, and I think the best thing that I can do from my perspective, is to bring this back to a Buddhist context, and in particular, an early Buddhist context. And the question we're going to be trying to answer here is what the Buddha had to say about similar things that happened during his lifespan, and what we might consider similar. And I mean, this is a big topic. It's not something that I can, of course, even hope to completely touch on in one video. So I'm going to come at this with humility. If there are other matters that you think need to be discussed or dealt with, either in early Buddhism or in the broader context, please do feel free to put them down in the comments below. I try to read all the comments on my videos. I try to comment on all of them, or as many as I can. So do feel free to leave your own thoughts. So what I'm going to do here is begin with the broader social context in early Buddhism. Then I'll discuss some of the Buddha's reactions to that broader social context. Then in the third section, I will talk about some of the nuances here. Some of the nuances in the Buddha's reaction. I mean, the Buddha had a definite opinion about a lot of what was going on, but again, these opinions were nuanced, and I think it's important to see the nuances and not to paper over them. And then finally, we'll get to what is the Buddha's, I think, most important and enduring legacy as far as his own social movement went. So that's going to be the framework of today's video. To begin with, the Buddha's broader society. There are some inklings from the texts, the Buddhist texts, these early texts in Pali, that having dark skin, being dark-colored, was looked down upon. There are not a lot of these, but there are some, and they seem to indicate an environment of what has been termed by some people proto-racism. That is to say, it's not racism in the full-blown sense that we find in the modern world, racism that's typified by a notion of sort of biological determinism. Nevertheless, there were similar kinds of ideas going around in the Buddha's day. There aren't a lot of these in the early texts, and the Buddha doesn't seem to have had any obvious reaction to them. Presumably he thought that they were foolish. In any event, he doesn't seem to have had very much to say. However, he does have a lot to say about a similar and related topic, which is the one that really I'm going to be dealing with in this video, which has to do with the notion of caste. Caste, as some of us will know, is a very important aspect of Indian society, of society back into Vedic Brahminism up to the present day. In many ways, caste in ancient India during the Buddha's lifetime played the same role, or at least a similar role, to that played by race in contemporary culture. There was an idea that caste was a birthright. It was something that came from the purity of your own birth. It was not the sort of thing that you could overcome by anything within your own lifetime. It was something that came simply from the features, the facts of who you were born from. And there was no way to escape that. In one of the early suttas, we read, the Brahmins say, only Brahmins are the light caste. Other castes are dark or black, depending on how we translate that term. And here we can hear a faint echo of this similarity between caste and race, which really does in a certain way propagate down to the present day. Now, in ancient India during the Buddha's lifetime, just as in contemporary India, there are 4 castes. The top caste, generally speaking, is understood to be the Brahmin caste. They are the priestly caste, the ones who knew the proper sacrifices, the proper rituals to appease the gods, the ones who memorized the Vedas. Under them were what could be understood as the aristocratic caste, or the warrior caste or ruler caste, known as the Kshatriyas or KHATTIYAS during the Buddha's lifetime. Under them were the VESSAS, Vaishyas, who were the merchant class. Under them were the SUDDAS or Shudras, who were the workers, the menials, laborers. And under them were the Chandalas, who were the outcasts. So there are 4 castes and then the outcast. This is the same caste structure that we saw in the Buddha's lifetime, and it's mentioned as well in these early suttas. Now, we may well wonder where this idea of these castes originated, and we don't really know where they originated from, but perhaps the earliest text that we can point to is known as the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda is one of these Vedic texts that is the foundation of Vedic Brahmanism, indeed the foundation of contemporary Hinduism. And the Purusha Sukta is a particular part of this Rig Veda. It's believed, however, that the Purusha Sukta came up later. It did not originate with the early Vedas, but was perhaps added later, maybe to justify this caste structure in some sense. But be that as it may, what we read in this text is that basically the Purusha is the word in Sanskrit that means person or man. It is a cosmic principle which is identified with or personified in a person, in the human form. It's sometimes identified with Brahman, this universal principle, this sort of godlike principle. And it's said that the Brahmin caste came from the mouth of this Purusha, this cosmic principle, because the Brahmins signified speech, signified knowledge and understanding because of their knowledge of the Vedas. Then the KHATTIYAS, or the aristocratic class, the warrior class, came from his arms because they signified strength in arms. Then the Vessas, or the merchant class, came from his thighs, and the Suddas, or the menial laborers, came from his feet. And we can understand with this kind of a poetic understanding of the caste structure, how the Brahmins set this up with them on top. They were the ones that were the highest of all of the castes. So all of this is to say that this was some of the background into which the Buddha was born. Some of the background in his area of ancient India and into Nepal. These ideas had percolated in there. And the Buddha, when he grew up, he had this as kind of something of a foil. And he had a response to this. We read of some of the Buddha's responses in the early suttas. Indeed, I should say a certain significant percentage of the early suttas are spent in responding to this kind of Vedic Brahmin understanding of the caste system. One of the things that the Buddha says is that, in fact, Brahmin children are born the same way from Brahmin mothers as other children are born from their mothers. That is to say, there's no difference between the birth of a Brahmin and the birth of any other person. So this is the Buddha's attempt to rebut this idea that Brahmins are born from the mouth of the deity, while other people from other castes are born from other parts of the deity. The Buddha says, no, in fact, all people are born exactly the same way. Now here it's also important, I think, to point out that the Buddha himself was a Khattiya, was born a Khattiya, or a Kshatriya, as it said in Sanskrit, which is one of the warrior caste, or the aristocratic caste, if you like. That is to say, he was born in a relatively wealthy, powerful, probably a land-owning family in his area, the area of Nepal, right on the border of India where he was born. And it seems from the early suttas that he considered the Khattiyya caste to be either higher than the Brahmin caste or at the same level, which indicates, interestingly, that probably Vedic Brahmanism was not quite as powerful, well-known, established in his area of India, Nepal, as it was perhaps in other areas. Because in his area, there was at least enough of a question that the Buddha and his family could consider that his caste was actually the highest one, that the Brahmin caste was lower down. And indeed, following the same kind of ideas, the Buddha, in one of his suttas, gives a history of the creation of caste, where he says that, again, pushing back on this idea that castes are a kind of divine emanation of some universal principle. Instead, the Buddha says that the idea of castes came out because people had different occupations. So as society came together, as society grew, we found people of different occupations. And as somebody was occupied with a certain kind of thing, they became named as that thing, and that's how these castes began. Then, later on, in another sutta, the Buddha is asked by King Pasenadi, who himself would have been a Khattiyya, he would have been in the aristocratic caste, one assumes. King Pasenadi asks him, what is the difference between the various castes? Is there a difference? And the Buddha says that the difference is that two of the castes are said to be more worthy of respect and honor than the other two. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about this statement. The first interesting thing is that he says two of the castes are said to be more worthy of respect and honor, more privileged, if you like, than the other two. Two, because I think ordinarily we would say that one of them is said to be more privileged, that is the Brahmin caste. But instead the Buddha puts two castes, again at about the same level, the Brahmin caste and the aristocratic caste. He's saying that they're both worthy of this respect and honor. They're said to be worthy. And that's also the other important thing, is that the Buddha is not saying they actually are worthy of respect. What he is saying is that within society, they are treated as more worthy of respect. He's not, in this, at least in this situation, he's not passing judgment on that particular fact about society. He's simply stating that the society is structured in that way. However, the Buddha does go on to say that any person of any caste is just as potentially capable of reaching awakening as any other person of any other caste. That is to say that there isn't any difference in caste when it comes to your potential for progress along the path. And the Buddha here gives a simile. He gives a simile as different types of wood. He says that just as you can make fires out of 4 different types of wood, he names 4 different trees, he says the fire is just the same fire. In other words, it burns, it's just as hot, it's just as capable of keeping you warm. It doesn't matter what the material is that you make the fire out of, the fire is the same in the relevant sense. In the same way, it doesn't matter what caste you're from, you can reach the same level of awakening if you put a diligent effort into it. And this is going to be a recurring theme with the Buddha. The Buddha's teaching in general is that meritorious differences between people, that is to say, differences between people that should result in our respecting and venerating some over others, those differences are due to our ethical abilities. That is to say, whether we are kind and compassionate in life, whether we're wise, whether we are good at meditative accomplishments, that is to say, whether we are able to achieve high meditative states. Those kinds of things are, for the Buddha, what makes you worthy in the sense of veneration. It has nothing to do with birth. In one early sutta, There are a couple of Brahmins, young Brahmins, who are having an argument about what makes somebody a proper Brahmin. One of them argues that to be a proper Brahmin is to be born of the right parents, that is to say, to have the most pure type of birth. Parents whose purity goes back 7 generations or whatever, that is what it is to be a proper Brahmin. The other person argues that being a proper Brahmin involves performing the proper rites and rituals and sacrifices in the proper way, behaving properly, basically. And they're in an argument and they're not able to come to any agreement, so they decide to go to the Buddha and ask him what it is to be a proper Brahmin. And the Buddha talks about these arguments. The Buddha says, when it comes to animals, the difference between, let's say, a bird and a rabbit, then that is determined by proper parentage. That is to say, it's purity of parents that decides what animal you are, whether you're a bird or whether you're a rabbit or a skunk or a squirrel. That depends upon your parents. But he says, between humans, that's not the case. All humans are born the same way, of the same kinds of parents. The differences between humans, the Buddha says, are essentially conventional. That is to say, that if you make your living by growing vegetables, then you're known as a farmer. That's an issue of convention, not an issue of birth for the Buddha. And this includes very much the idea of caste, so that all of the castes are conventional in this sense. They just depend upon what livelihood somebody happens to have or to have been born into. They're not an issue of innate worth of anybody. However, the Brahmins wanted to know what makes somebody a good Brahmin, and so the Buddha does give them an answer here. However, what the Buddha does is to basically redefine the term Brahmin. What the Buddha says is that a good Brahmin is somebody who has become awakened. However, as we've already seen, the Buddha believes that anybody from any caste can become awakened. So, to become a good Brahmin simply means to be somebody who is particularly accomplished on the path towards awakening, who is particularly wise, who is particularly ethical, who is particularly accomplished in meditative insights. These kinds of things are what makes somebody a Brahmin. That is, again, what he's doing here is redefining the term, which is something the Buddha loved to do, redefine the term such that all of a sudden the ordinary discussions among people become completely turned around. Now, before I move into the next section on the nuances here, I do want to stress, however, that the Buddha's conclusions here are really quite revolutionary, particularly within the context of ancient India. What he's saying is quite general and quite universal. That is to say, that caste signifies absolutely nothing about the worth of an individual. Caste is conventional, completely conventional. That the true worth of an individual is due to their behavior, their intentions, the purity of their intentions, whether they act out of greed, hatred, and delusion, or whether they act out of kindness and compassion and generosity and wisdom. That is the only thing that distinguishes one person from another. Now to turn to some of the nuances, which I think also are important to get into and stress, because they're also part of the Dharma of early Buddhism. The first thing to say is that the Buddha did believe and teach that our karmic consequences might involve things having to do with caste. That is to say, that the Buddha taught that if we do certain kinds of wrong behaviors, wrong actions, if we take upon ourselves certain kinds of bad karma, we can be reborn into lives that are miserable. That is to say, into lives as humans who are sick or poor or ugly, or in lower caste or lower class environments. In particular, the Buddha argued that people who were obstinate and vain in one life would be reborn into a future life in which they would be underprivileged, into which they would not have the respect that they might otherwise have been due. That is to say, that being born into an underprivileged life might be the consequence of having behaved in a vain or obstinate, arrogant way in a prior lifetime. Now, it has to be said that not all that happens to us, either good or bad, is due to karma on the Buddha's own understanding. The Buddha did teach that some things that happen bad to us happen simply for random reasons, without any particular reasoning to it. But nevertheless, some things were due to karma. Now, the question is what we want to do with this kind of information. That is to say that people born into certain kinds of underprivileged lives may be born into those lives because of their own bad actions previously. Now, for myself, this is the sort of thing that makes me put aside the notion of rebirth, literal rebirth, feeling that it is too much like blaming the victim. However, that said, I do know that many people find the notion of rebirth convincing, useful, even skillful and helpful to them on the path. This is certainly a part of traditional Buddhist belief. And I think we all have to sort of come to terms with some of the Buddha's teachings on this matter and decide what we want to do with them. In any event, it's clear that while caste for the Buddha was something completely conventional that didn't signify anything about the worth of the individual in that caste, nevertheless, he did believe that caste could be a result of your karmic background. Being born in a particular caste could be because of what you've done previously. The Buddha also, a separate issue here, never, to my knowledge in the suttas, argued for or agitated for the abolishment of caste in the broader society. Nor did he argue for the abolishment of slavery in the broader society. Now, to be fair, slavery in the Buddha's day was not something that was related to caste or to race or anything like that. It was rather an issue of armies defeating other armies and taking people as captives and then enslaving them. Nevertheless, it clearly was an unjust practice, and the Buddha was quite aware of it. And he did not agitate for either one to be abolished. Now, we might wonder why the Buddha wouldn't have argued for these things to be abolished. It's not clear because the texts simply don't say anything one way or the other. We can speculate, perhaps, that the Buddha didn't have anything to say about this because he didn't feel it was possible to abolish these kinds of things, that they simply were part of the broader society, part of what made life painful and difficult, the First Noble Truth. But that's simply speculation. In general, as the scholar of early Buddhism, Richard Gombrich, has argued, and I've made videos about this in the past, the Buddha seems not to have been interested in changing the broader society. He was not particularly interested in political aims in that sense, which is not to say that we can't derive some ideas of politics from what he did teach, and he certainly did have things to say about a just society, but after having said them, it seems to have ended there, at least so far as we can tell from these texts, the texts that remain to us. But while the Buddha was not particularly interested in, or at least doesn't seem to have been particularly interested in changing the broader society in the longer term, he was interested, very interested in certain social aims, and that's what we'll turn to now. He was particularly interested in creating a good society, but in doing it in a particular way. That is to say, he was very interested in creating what we might call a kind of idealized society, which was the Sangha, the group of monastics, the monastic organization. And this was an organization in which caste was to play no role. That is, once you joined the Sangha, you essentially gave up caste. You were no longer a member of your caste and were no longer to be judged by that caste. Instead, within the Sangha, the only real distinctions made between monastics was based on seniority, that is to say, how long you had been a monastic. That was the real only difference, and of course, we're not going to be discussing gender and sexuality in this particular video, but there was a significant difference between male and female monastics. I have an earlier video on women in Buddhism where I discuss some of that, and I'll leave a link to that down below. But those were the distinctions there. There were not caste distinctions. And further, the Buddha allowed that anybody from any caste could join the Sangha, could become a monastic. Indeed, there's a very touching early poem, one of the early poems of the first monastics, which is written by Sunita, who seems to have been an outcast. His profession, his job, was to clear up and clean out dead flowers. Presumably that he was somebody who was employed in some sense by a shrine where people would come to leave flowers, and when the flowers would die and decay, his job was to remove them and dispose of them. And I think this is a very touching kind of thing. It reminds me of the cherry blossoms in Japan. We can think of the Japanese aesthetic of cherry blossoms being the sorts of things that symbolize the transient nature of beauty. They come, they're beautiful for only a short period of time, a few days. Then they fall onto the ground and have to be cleared away. And Sunita's job was to do just that, to clear away these dead flowers. And Sunita talks about how when he was in that position, he would make reverence to many people who would come by, presumably who would, various religious or wisdom leaders who would come to whatever shrine he was at to pay their respects. He would venerate them, and they would reject him. They would treat him like an outcast, the outcast that presumably he was. And he says this changed with the Buddha, that the Buddha actually expressed an interest in him. And Sunita asked to be allowed into the Sangha of monastics. And the Buddha said, "Come, monk." That was the way that the Buddha, during the early part of his ministry, would ordain somebody. The complex and difficult ordination ceremonies and all this time that would take, that hadn't arrived yet, that hadn't come on the scene yet. In the early days, the Buddha would simply say, "Come, monk." That was all you needed in order to become a monastic in the Buddha's Sangha. And Sunita says that after being ordained, he made a tireless effort at the Buddhist practice, at the practice of the Dharma, and eventually was able to attain awakening. And Sunita says that after having attained awakening, he went to the Buddha himself and declared that he had attained the final goal. And the Buddha said to him, in a very touching thing, he said, "That's how you become a Brahmin. That's how you become the supreme Brahmin." And it's a wonderful irony here, where Sunita, who was born an outcast, is, in the Buddha's eyes, higher, is a better person. He's the supreme Brahmin. He is better than any of the Brahmins out there who have not attained awakening yet. He's become the person that he wanted to be. And I think this continuing effort on behalf of the underprivileged has, in more recent years, expanded out beyond simply the Sangha into the wider society. And indeed, in the 20th century, there was a very famous Buddhist politician, thinker, agitator, B.R. Ambedkar, who has pushed for the abolishment of caste in India, and indeed been at least partially successful in that regard, as well as in ordaining people into Buddhism, or making people Buddhists so that they could lose their caste affiliation or their outcast status. And I did an earlier video on Ambedkar's work, which I think would be a wonderful thing to take a look at now if you haven't seen it already. I'll put a link to it here up on the screen. Thanks so much to all of you, and remember, Black Lives Matter.